Welcome to today's webinar entitled Designing for Human Behavior. My name is Billy Zadig, Manager of Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA website later this afternoon. Please visit our website at www.apa.org to register for upcoming events and to view archived webinars for continuing education credits found under the Continuous Learning tab. Professional Continuing Education and AIA CLU certificates are being offered for today's program. If you are an AIA professional, please send an email to me at billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, at apa.org, along with your AIA membership number if you have not done so in the past. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. If you are just calling in, make sure to send me an email at billie@apa.org so I can send you a certificate if you would like one. The system will only recognize you if you log in. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Joe Agati. Joe, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Like we said, we're going to be talking about designing for human behavior here. So I just want to usually start off with a little background on me. So I have a degree in industrial design, which is not designing for factories, which is usually a question I get quite a bit. It's designing for industry, so product design, product development. I've been doing that for about 15-ish years now. I started my career off with a toy company here in the west side of Chicago, Radio Flyer. I think most people are known them for the Little Red Wagon. And while I was there, not only is it a wonderful company to work for, great people, family-owned business, they shared my same kind of like passion for design and the approach to design. And it's really coming from observing human behavior. So every one of the products you kind of see on here are projects that I, either managed or worked on. And all of these have what they call kind of key consumer insights, involved with them, and then that leads to the kind of like the point of innovation. So for like this wagon example, every time you go to a zoo or a parade and you're seeing people, trying to strap stuff to the wagon, especially now as being a new parent, realizing how much stuff comes with kids, you realize that there's a better way that we can do this. We can make a more enjoyable experience. And it's not something, incredibly revolutionary, but just being able to try to find a way to store things that, you may need for your trip. Same thing with this tricycle. When you watch a kid try to climb on and off a tricycle, especially younger kids that are, don't have the kind of same balance that they will have 3 years, as they, age about 3 years. And then you're trying to have them kind of, pair that with, an unstable trike, and you see them fall over. You say, there's got to be a better way to do this. Let's lower the seat to the ground, put their legs in line with the pedals, so it's easier for them to learn how to pedal. Because pedaling is a very complicated, motion for a young child. So each one of these products has a story behind it where we identified some kind of human behavior, whether it was parent-driven, child-driven, or both, and then use that as a kind of a point of innovation to kind of create something new. And so Agati obviously shares that same passion. That's something that I've inherited from my father, who started the company in the mid 80s. And every one of the products, as the company has evolved, have all come from some kind of point of observing human behavior and finding those we call them key user insights, and then turning that into a product. So something just as simple as asking the question of like, why does a wooden library chair need to be uncomfortable? It doesn't. We can make wooden chairs comfortable. And then at the time, when the business was involved, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of library projects, coming and tilting the chair, putting the lumbar into the wood chair, positioning it right to make that wooden chair comfortable. So like I said, every one of these has those points of innovation, and some are larger, rethinking the study carrel, rethinking kind of room and flexibility in the space, but some can be, just as simple as asking the question of like, why can't we make the chair comfortable? And so, like I said before, this all comes from designing for human behavior. And so usually people are saying, well, why do we care about this? What is the kind of the impact point here? Well, when we understand our behavior, we understand why we do the things we do. And it's challenging because as a species, we're not very self-aware always of what we're doing or why we're doing it. But it plays into our mental health and wellness. And when we started doing this presentation about 5-6 years ago, the talk of mental health and wellness was kind of like, that was a new thing. Like, well, what do you mean mental health and wellness? Who cares about that? That topic was just starting to be broached, especially in like the kind of corporate world where companies are starting to pay attention. Like, hey, if I care more about how my employees feel, they're going to enjoy coming to work more. They're going to get along with their coworkers, and hey, they're going to be more productive. Looking back, especially going through a pandemic, it seems silly that like, why was this even a question? Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we not care about our mental health and wellness? But at the end of the day, we're all trying to get to this kind of peace of mind state. So I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to kind of talk about this. For those of you who are familiar, Maslow's a sociologist from the 40s and 50s, and he came up with this kind of pyramid of needs here. So down at the bottom, you've got your psychological needs, and these are the necessities: food, water, rest, security, safety, kind of going all the way up to self-actualization. And so he breaks it up into basic needs, your psychological needs, and then your self-fulfillment needs. And so really what I tend to focus on, and especially in this talk, and when we're thinking about product and design, is really kind of focusing on these basic needs. Because if we're not really addressing these, we're not really putting people in the position to kind of make them feel comfortable. And if you're not going to feel comfortable, it's really going to be harder to kind of escalate up to self-fulfillment. If you're not comfortable, like, how can you focus? And how can you focus? How are you really going to work? And if you can't really feel comfortable, focus, and work, it's going to be hard to achieve. So really trying to address those basic needs. And so where that comes from, and I use these examples, if we think about, our primal ancestors, our species started off gathering in caves. Caves provided warmth. Caves gave us a way to, kind of protect our food. Caves gave us the ability to kind of keep people inside safe, while we can survey our environment. So this all meant our survival. So this is how our species has survived. So this is kind of hardwired into us. There's I'm not sure if people are familiar with biophilia. They talk about this from perspective of refuge. We're hardwired to kind of seek out refuge, and we're hardwired to, want to have a certain level of prospect over our environment. These are the things that make us feel comfortable. And so if we think about our caveman brethren here, we would encounter kind of threats in our environment. Maybe could be animals, could be unknown tribes, people, whatever it may be. And these things triggered stress. And stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it's a hardwired response to our survival. When we feel stress, we exert adrenaline, cortisol, the fight or flight kind of chemical release into our body. Again, this has led to our survival. So what I keep trying to hammer in here, this is like hard grained into us. So if we think about our, human, more modern selves, we feel stress, and it can come in a lot of different ways: unknown people, crowds, money, job. There's stress triggers. The challenge with today is that with these stress triggers, you're still getting the chemical response, but we're getting triggered by more things than our body was intended to handle. So when you're getting those stress responses that aren't really are life-threatening, it's going to start to have a negative impact on your health and your mental well-being. And so, if we think about that, how do we, we're, coming back to this, we're hardwired to kind of find these safe spaces. And I give another example of, if we think about our, when we were kids, I'm obviously a much more tactile person, but I think a lot of people can relate to like the fort play. like to seek out these spaces. If you think about a child, the fort is really engaging to them. It's this like secure environment. Like a child's world, it can be very overwhelming. And if anybody's got a kid that's had a temper tantrum, it's a lot of that has come because their brain is like scrambled. They're just overwhelmed. And you try to ask them more questions and they just keep freaking out because their brain is overwhelmed. Well, the world can be overwhelming when you're short and everything's taller and then, yeah, I guess you don't know any better, but it can be challenging. So, it's not uncommon to have kids seek out these spaces because now everything's kind of brought down to them, and they're usually made out of blankets or something, so they're all cozy. It's kind of like crawling into like a nice big hug. Again, this is coming from that survival instinct. So if we think about our behavior over time, we've evolved, and it's taken a long time for us to get here. So our behavior doesn't really change. But if we think about the contemporary world around us and things that evolve around us, technology is really, really fast. It evolves incredibly quickly. This is just an example of a snapshot of 15 years here of like an iPad, iPod to iPad generation. 15 years, how fast that's evolved. Communication, how quickly communication has changed. I'm on the older end of the millennial generation, but I remember the dial-up internet days. You pay by the minute, you get the CD of 10,000 free minutes. That was kind of like the new way to kind of communicate with people. But now it's grown so exponentially. But our behavior, the things that make us who we are, do what we do, that really doesn't change that dramatically. So I use this as an example, and I like this example because it's just a good snapshot in time. You got 10 years apart. So you think about to that kind of 15-year window on technology was evolving so rapidly, and you saw all the changes. So if you look at it, the technology has changed dramatically. 2006 was going to the library. That was a common way to access technology. I graduated in 2006, so that was really common that we would go to the computer centers to access, all the like higher grade CAD software and rendering. So it was really common to go to an institution to do that. Nowadays, I'm sure there's still computer labs and things like that, but it's very, very common that people have multiple devices with them at all times. But what's interesting in this photo is that if you look at over those 10 years periods while the technology has changed, the behavior is not that different. I mean, there's still, people are drawn to these curved booth seatings. They both sit in the middle. Everybody likes to have the bag on either side of them. They both, everybody has a book in front of them. And I always like to point out that, in 2006, 10, 15-year paper's going to be dead. We're not going to be doing any books. It's all going to be e-readers. There's a lot of paper. When you go through a college or university and you watch kids work, there's a lot of paper floating around out there. So people like to sit in the middle of the banquette. So this behavior is still kind of ingrained. So we're going to talk about kind of why, what's going on here as we kind of go through this presentation. So why else do we care about this? Yes, obviously making people feel comfortable. Our mental health is important. When you think about these too, is like increases utilization of space. If we can make the space engaging, more people are going to want to come there. There's a part of like holding our aesthetic, and aesthetic is a challenge, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end here. But holding the aesthetic over time, and then a lot of that leads into not wasting money. We're a firm believer here at Agati, the most sustainable, both environmentally and economically, thing is the piece of furniture you don't buy. If we can, the closer we can get it to right the first time around, the better. So I want to just dig back into that example. This was at, here earlier that I showed you. This is at North Park University, because there's some other interesting lessons going on in there. And so we were brought in after they had purchased a lot of kind of like Ottoman style kind of touchdown spaces. And so they had this large atrium area, and they said, this is kind of going to waste. We should do something more with it. So they put these in there, and it didn't really get used. The kids nicknamed it the Ottoman Empire. And so they're, they tried something, and let's learn from that. It didn't work. So why is it not working? Well, it's very large, very open. It's hard to find those places that are going to make you kind of feel comfortable and secure. So, they swung the pendulum kind of the other side. So let's put in, big booth type products. And around this time, we had kind of noticed this trend of like booth seating had been real popular starting kind of 2012, 13, and really kind of growing. And so started to notice like people were really drawn to this. But you got one person sitting in a booth that's meant for multiple people. That I don't love seeing that. That bugs me. So it's like, well, we corrected a problem. It is more utilized. That's good. But the pendulum swung too far to the other side. So it's all about kind of getting to that balance. And this is where I've been starting to spend a little bit more time just talking about balance in this presentation because as trends kind of peak and valley, and obviously we're coming out of a lot of turbulence, and so there's going to be, I think people seeking out some new trends, and things are going to evolve. I just caution people; it's always in the long-term benefit to try to strike the balance. I came through when I started at Agati, the big trend was media stations. Everything's got collaboration. We got to collaborate and work together, and there's just floors, and I need tons of media stations, and it just swung too far to the other side. And then you ran into this issue of like one person using a media station. It's like, oh, it's not really what the goal or the intent was. And so learning from that, saying, hey, we got to try to balance this out more. And I think people have really kind of just started to grab onto that. But like I said, I always want to touch here just a little bit longer because we're coming out of this turmoil. And that's where I usually start to see kind of like the hard trend swings. So as you're thinking about that, and we're going to talk about what makes people feel comfortable in here, we're going to talk about through the lens of public space. And the reason why we do that, that's what our furniture is designed for. When we're thinking of things, we're thinking of it in the public space environment, high use, 24/7 use, universities, public libraries, airports, things like that. And that's also where we're going to be at our most vulnerable. So we're going to be kind of at our heightened level. And so there's three elements that we're going to go over today. One is space, and not the environment, not the interior architecture, things like that, which is important. Don't get me wrong. That's not where my background lies, but it's more about the space between us. The next element is this haven or this refuge effect. From the biophilia kind of terms. This kind of warm blanket feeling that makes us feel comfortable. And then comfort. So comfort meaning in the literal sense of like what kind of chair, different types of chairs, how do we pair this with different activities, comfort in that sense. So from space standpoint, like I said, we're talking about the space around us. So lots of times when we're thinking about something, we know that people have this bubble around them. And that bubble, depending where we are, who we're with, what environment we're in, that shrinks and grows. I've given the example. I lived in Hong Kong for about 5 months. There's no bubble as far as I'm concerned there. It's a super dense city. It's a super dense, especially that area, Hong Kong, China area, that country there, it's super dense. There's just not, culturally the bubble is different. For here in the United States, it's about 12 inches. So, I give the example here of like, if you think about like riding on a bus, and those of you that maybe are from more urban environment like me, take public transportation a lot. But all experience, you get on the bus, especially in the northern part here, it's like December, January, so it's cold. It's dark at like 4:30, so you're leaving work, and it's like not, it's not late, but you feel somewhat isolated. The bus is kind of empty. So you get on, you sit down, and then you go a stop or two, and then someone gets on. And you're like, I don't know this person. There's everywhere to sit on the bus. I just don't want them to sit next to me. And sure as heck, they sit next to you. And you're just thinking, this is just so weird. Why would someone, like, I know what makes me feel comfortable. This is like ingrained in me. Why would someone not want to have a certain amount of space between an unknown person? So it throws you off. It's not kind of in line of what we're used to. You start to think maybe there's something wrong with this person. Vice versa, if someone gets on and you know them and they don't sit kind of next to you, close to you, it's more of like a snub. So that's where that kind of bubble can kind of shrink and grow. Like I said before, when we're thinking about this in context, in the public space environment, if you don't really know people, 12 inches is a good kind of buffer amount. I get a lot of questions, has this changed because of COVID? I would say early on, yes. I noticed myself, like, we had, kind of been told and ingrained, and we didn't know what was going on. So it's like safer is better. That kind of, especially in 2020, 2021, was still kind of ingrained. that has kind of faded away. Again, we're going to drift, maybe you saw this little spike, but over the long period of maybe we're going to drift back towards what our baseline is. We like to have engagement with people. We are social animals and creatures. We like to have a certain level of engagement and a certain level of connection. So, when we think about it from that individual standpoint, that it is kind of coming back to that 12 inches. And, I kind of, gut check that against my self. I'm finding myself, yes, being closer to people. I'm getting less, I have less apprehension as we kind of continue down away from hopefully a peak of COVID here. So I want to talk about, this from a couple of perspectives. One being tables. And so I use this because this is an example a lot of us can relate to. Giant room, big tables, 8 chairs to a table. And we've kind of seen the pattern develop where, library or whatever space opens up. And what do people do? So people start to gather kind of in the middle of the table. And well, why is that? We're talking about, this level of refuge that people want to have, this level of space we want to create around ourselves. So this kind of makes sense. I can sit in the middle here. I can put my bag here that really defines, hey, you stay away from me. I got this bag that defends my space. I got a whole chunk of table here that I can keep that space bubble away from me from. And then, you get to a critical mass in an environment, and then what happens next? Well, people start to sit at the corner. Again, why? Well, I don't know these people. This puts me that just bit closer, and I got to look them in the eye. Very uncomfortable with strangers. And then I can put my bag here knowing that I can keep this space for myself. And I know, no one can sit here. So, again, you get to like a critical mass in the environment, and then someone sits here. And then you start to develop this kind of natural pattern. Now, I'm not saying that people don't sit together in groups. Usually they know people, and or sometimes if they do, let's say it's a peak, season, maybe it's a midterm, a final, if we're, talking about a university setting, and you're going to be forced to sit next to people. But I use that word forced because if you see how people are choosing to naturally kind of fill the environment, so they've now run out of space and they need a place to study, and they are now at the point where I have no other option. So I'm going to sit next to an unknown person. And we all accept that, but I guess what I'm challenging is that how comfortable does that person feel, both the person that kind of staked the claim and the person now that's invading it, how comfortable does that make them feel? So, if you think about it too, it's like, I think what's happened is like, we've been kind of trained and forced to kind of like meet these like a certain level of densities, but not really asking the questions like, well, is it really working? Because like, yeah, I have a seat count, but if they're not really getting used, do we really need that seat count? And I understand there's like pragmatic challenges, like a law library. They have to have a seat count. And so it's not a perfect world, but it's going to, I think the idea is we're going to have to try to take fight the battles that we can win in certain areas and find the opportunities where things do make sense. But another way to think about it is that these are lost seats. If you don't need them, let's not buy them. Let's think about what we can do. And then if people are kind of telling us like how much space they like to have and feel comfortable, so let's make that table design work with that environment. So this is one example of a way to do that. This is we call this a zigzag table. So people don't sit direct from across each other. You get a nice healthy amount of workspace in there. And so one thing that's nice too is that actually if you push them inside of that table, kind of like invisible edge there, it heightens that kind of feeling of kind of like command central or kind of refuge or that implied refuge that we'll kind of continue to talk about here, and that'll allow people to feel more comfortable, quote unquote, sitting next to each other. And so usually what I tell people is that don't confuse a wavy table with a zigzag table. The zigzag has a deep arc here, smaller arc here, and sitting people at these kind of peaks is like thrusting them kind of out into that room. Again, they'll do, you run out of space, they'll sit there, but I would question how comfortable does that make them feel. So, but this isn't dead space. Lots of times when we're doing zigzag type tables, they're really great for individuals or a couple people to work together. We see a lot of kind of I don't call it group work, but like, social dynamic work where I know this person, we can kind of collaborate here. If I don't know them, that's great. We don't use that zone. So it's not like you're wasting the space there. And there's other ways you can kind of achieve this. Again, just you don't have to do a zigzag table. You can kind of just rethink the furniture kind of placement, maybe going smaller. This is really common practice in public libraries, to think, a little smaller scale to make things a little more dynamic, flexible. So there's ways that there's multiple ways that this can be done. So one thing I want to touch on here is we talk about tables too, because we've kind of been looking at it from kind of the top-down perspective here. And especially like when we first started doing this, we would kind of stop this section here. But as this is, as we've kind of evolved and we've learned, we start to notice, high tables kind of playing a little different role in the environment. It was really interesting because it touches into that prospect element that we talked about at the very beginning here. So if you think about like kind of two different perspectives, you got a low table and a high table, and then you have someone kind of walking through the space. And these are the two different kind of like maybe three different viewpoints. And if you look at like maybe from like a height level perspective here and kind of map that out. So if I'm sitting at a low, like a traditional seated table, my prospect, viewpoint is already kind of low to start with. At the high table, I'm almost at like eye level, with someone walking through the space. And so then if you actually make it so like, okay, well, we're not always just staring at our environment, we're actually working. So we're really kind of engaging the environment through our peripherals. Even at that high seated table, you still have a decent kind of like sight line within the environment. And this prospect, is another way that people will feel comfortable in the space. Like a refuge helps, and that's an element of it. But in lack of refuge, if I have the ability to see and defend myself from a distance, that makes us feel more comfortable. So it's interesting as you get higher traffic and maybe you need more seating, you do need seating density. High tables can kind of help with that, and we will see people kind of sit closer and closer to that bubble will start to shrink a little bit more in that environment when you can kind of see people higher. So I want to shift gears a second here. So we've been talking about space kind of like from just a table and chair perspective. I want to just talk about maybe just so much from just a seating only perspective. And we talk about this too because we, again, from our background, we do a lot of airports, waiting spaces, and we're the public and space environment, so a lot of kind of like the transition areas. So it's not uncommon to see, lounge chairs like put all together at one. Sometimes we try to do the thing where we put the arm in between, to try to space the chairs out. Something we always recommend to people, and again, this is becoming much, much more common, is try to push that distance between the chairs, because what always happens, and again, we see this lots of times, people will sit down and leave the space. And both options, this is a great way. Leave a whole space between me. I'll put the bag there. Again, defend my kind of environment. But if we push that 12 inches and try to get to that 12-inch mark in there, you get people to sit there. And so I typically argue that, like, yeah, you're putting a seat count you need to hit, but if we're calculating the seat loss on that seat count, you can probably get, if you put that 12 inches in, you probably get all these seats to be filled up, by adjusting that, because it's a lot better to lose this space with a bag than this space. This is 12 and that's 23, 26 inches, depending on how you're calculating now without arms. You're losing a lot of space. So sacrificing, 12 inches in there, you may lose a little density, but you'll increase your utilization there. Because now you're giving us an appropriate space for someone to put their bag to defend their environment. And that gives you opportunity and great power and things. There's obviously other added benefits. And so what I want to transition into is thinking about seating and integrating panels, high backs, so thinking about the example of clusters of lounge chairs around a table. And again, it's not to say never to do this, but it's going back to that balance part. Do I have people that tend to want to work more in groups or be more individual? And so really, because if you're on the more individual side, someone's going to sit down, another person may sit down, they're going to put their bags or kind of defend their environment. So you're really only getting two people to sit in this kind of arrangement, versus if we rethink these seating clusters, integrate some panels in there, you will get 4 people to sit here. And this is a much tighter footprint. And like I said, 4 people will sit in these things because they're not really engaged with the people kind of either on the side or behind them. And so instead of taking up 80 square feet where maybe you get 2, you'll get 30 square feet. Well, you'll get 4 in there. And then it's really defining the balance. So that there's groups of the kids or adults or whatever, they're going to gather together. So you want to have, I'm not saying never to have these, you want to have that, but really it's going to come down to understanding the environment, institution, the culture, to say what is the right balance. To say, like, I see, we have a whole bunch of these, we have 10 of these, and 7 out of 10 are always with 1 to 2 people. You've got an opportunity to kind of integrate some more single kind of clusters in there. So the next thing we want to talk about, so we're going to talk about three kind of elements today. The next one is this kind of haven/refuge feeling we want to create. And like I said, when we were talking about the North Park example, this is something we were kind of like around that time, 2014, 15. We're kind of like noticing that people are gravitating towards these banquettes. It's kind of getting into the height of the banquet kind of phenomenon, or not phenomenon, but kind of craze. And they're saying, well, why aren't they using the study carols? And so if you look at it here, people like to sit in the middle. I mean, I always equate it to, it's like, you go out to brunch, and what do you want to do? Everybody wants to sit in the booth. The booths are nice and cozy. This is a higher back, this is a lower back, but sit in the middle, got the bag in there. You're kind of, you're creating this nice, cozy environment for them. But like I said before, I don't love seeing this. This is meant for multiple people. So the fact that, look at it all right here, multiple people. This is a really big workstation. This is a lot of footprint for a handful of people to work. So don't love seeing that. So we're starting to ask ourselves, well, why these and not the carol? Because the carol gives you privacy. I've got, my blinders on, I've got, something in front of me. But what's really the difference there is the lack of security, like lack of zone of security. Your back is out to the environment. And so we really started to kind of realize it's like, hey, we want to, we know that people love the booth experience, but we're losing this utilization kind of component, like all these things that we're trying to help people do, we're working against ourselves. So how do we take this and turn the carol so that then someone can sit inside the carol? So you get that zone of security. And so, offering, and I kind of show these here and I kind of point them out. What was interesting is that, we kind of, when we launched this, like I said, 14, 15, people, I didn't know what people were going to do. And it's been really fascinating to see like how many people gravitate towards the more organic form of this. They both do the same thing. This provides actually more surface area, but people gravitate towards the round ones. And I think there's just something in that design semester that really implies, there's the design language of this refuge that ties into like that comfort feeling that makes us feel like we're sitting in that nice warm hug here. And so usually what I, tell people is like, this is, again, putting down individual carol stations is not the only way to achieve this. There are other ways. But first way to kind of build like a strong refuge feeling is being able to cover the back. So where we can provide environments that make sense to do that, it's a great offer to people. You're going to kind of build on that kind of comfort level. I always say, people think like, trying to like cover two sides is better. But what we find actually is like one benefit of the carol is that you don't have anything in front of you. You don't have this disruption of somebody walking in front of you and disrupting you. So if there's opportunity to kind of cut down on that kind of like walk by or kind of like have to pop my head up as everything kind of comes by in my peripheral, that kind of helps build on that refuge feeling. And then if you can cover a side, that's great. And then you still are, you've got, call it your escape path. If something was to come up and attack you, you still got your escape path. So you got a way, to get out. And I think really building on these, really kind of build into that refuge feeling. And what's nice is that they're still open. So you still have a certain kind of connection to the environment. And so I want to kind of talk about that too, because when we first started doing this presentation, we weren't as cognizant to the prospect kind of elements. We started adding this in here because we would get questions about panel height all the time. And so really what we notice is that like there's a zone of security that makes people feel comfortable in here. So you want to have a certain height, but you also don't want to be too high. And that works against you from two reasons. One, person sitting in there, we have this kind of like rule. If you can do the head neck stretch and kind of just see out the environment, that seems to be good enough to make people either, once the head's back down, makes people feel comfortable, both kind of refuge-wise and prospect-wise. So both like in their environment and connected to the outside environment. Two, the higher the panel goes, the harder it is for someone walking through the space to see what's going on there. Now, we get a lot of comments from, people at universities like, I got to be able to see how many heads are in these things. I don't trust these kids. And so that is a pragmatic problem that you have to deal with. But two, also thinking about it from the comfort standpoint of, you have to get that much closer to somebody to see if somebody is working in there, thus disturbing them. And then the person walking into the space, they don't feel that connected because they're a prospect of their environment. They can't tell, like, well, how many people are in here? Are these all open? Are these all full? What's going to jump out and get me? So usually I encourage people somewhere between 39 to 48 inches seems to be a pretty good sweet spot. As you go higher than 48 inches, you start to get this diminishing return. And so there's a lot of ways to, whether it's booth, smaller booth, individual stations. There's even more now out there than what I've included here. So there's a number of ways to kind of achieve this effect. So the last element I want to talk about today is comfort. And like I said, it's, the first two parts were part of comfort, part of this kind of psychological feeling of comfort. But this is kind of more in like the, I guess you call it physical sense. So I want to talk about like four kind of, seating positions or working positions here. So you have a lounge, you have this work lounge kind of position, and then you have this working long and working quick. And so for a lounge chair, I put in this 20-20 rule. And so really what it's to illustrate is that you're going to have a greater recline on the chair. You're going to have a greater depth on the chair. And it also sits a bit lower than traditional chairs. But it's going to just kind of, it's a chair that's going to kind of pull you in more. You're lounging. I'm not pulling it up to a table. I'm going to be, again, lounging in this. And so when we think of lounging, lots of times, the lounge means hanging out long periods of time. And there is an element of that. But a lot of lounge chairs are used for kind of quicker activities, waiting, checking phones, checking tablets. And then you have this kind of longer activity, maybe reading, relaxing. Maybe it is having a long conversation and this hanging out kind of activity that happens there. But where we always kind of want to be a little clear on this, we're not big advocates of working in lounge chairs. And again, it's not to say the kids won't do it or people won't do it. I work in lounge chairs from time to time, but it's really not optimized for that. You're not putting yourself in the most kind of comfortable position for a long kind of working activity, especially if it's got computer, books, multiple items. It's not really set up for that. What is this kind of like pull-up chair to a table. This is really what's meant for kind of longer activities. And the reason is that falls into this 10-18-18 rule, where that you are kind of more vertical in your sit. So you got a 10 degree support in the back here. And then you're going to be shallower and higher on your chair, putting you at like a good position to sit at a table. And whether it's writing, reading, computer work, combination of that, that's really what's going to put you in the best posture there. And so and I always like to kind of point out that same ratio should still exist, that back support should still exist if you go to higher tables. And I think as higher tables have gone on in trend, sometimes people aren't always cognizant of like stools, and when they're evaluating stools, that 18 inches has got to be similar to where you're, when you're in the stool side of things, maybe just a little higher because you don't want your feet dangling. And that's always the thing is it drives me nuts when the foot rails are too low and you got kind of dangling feet. It's kind of defeating the purpose. You're pulling people out of that kind of comfort there. So with this, I like to point out, and we talked about this work lounge because they share similarities, and I bring it up. Still, I'm seeing it happen less and less, but I bring it up still because people are forgetting, because like the work lounge is like a banquette, and especially when the banquette craze was kind of at its peak, that people were putting lounge chairs at tables. And really what it is it's all about this kind of back support in here. So like we said, it's not a lounge chair. It's closer to like a side chair. It should share almost the same proportions. It may start off sitting a little higher because you have to account for like maybe an inch or more loss of seat, due to the cushion. So if you got 18 inches on a chair, 19 inches on a banquette is acceptable because you're going to account for that kind of depression as someone sits down. But it's not that lounge chair. And what the difference is that when you put a lounge chair at a table, you're going to be perching. You're going to have to scoot forward. It's going to cause you to kind of not engage at the back. You're going to slouch. You're going to get a pain in your neck. It's just not set up for that. Lounge chairs have their place, just not at like a high table. And so when we look at these, like I said, these are designed for like the longer kind of work activities. So 30 to 60 minutes, dining, working, computer work, studying, that kind of, I'm going to come, I'm going to camp out and spend some time here. And the last one is the high table. So not high table where we're sitting at, but high table where we're standing at. So again, 39, 42 inches high. And these are good for just quick touchdown spaces, whether it's like chit-chatting, meeting space, quick meeting spaces, lookup stations, anything that's kind of a shorter activity. Standing for long periods of time is not the best. Changing up the environment so you can, sit down here, stand there. We're a little more advocates of not sit to stand tables in the public space. Those are great for offices, but more so just having products that kind of at two different levels. And so I use this to kind of map out just so you can kind of see like all in one shot of like how much time people may spend by product, just to get people thinking that like, hey, if I'm gonna put down like some banquettes type style seating or study tables, I don't want to have like a high turnover traffic going right through that space. The best we can, kind of, if you got a walkway, high tables are great by a walkway because people will feel more comfortable sitting in dense, kind of denser, closer together than same level. And then that blends into maybe lower kind of seating, could be longer term lounge, longer term study area, as it kind of goes through the space. So just kind of one way to kind of think about that programming. So we talked about these three elements today. We talked about space, and like I said, the space, not so much the architectural environment, which is crucial. Don't get me wrong, but the space between us, that personal bubble, and how that shrinks and grows depending on environment. But that 12 inches for the public space seems to be that sweet spot. That haven or refuge effect, how do we create that kind of warm blanket feeling? And a lot of that comes from, being able to cover somebody's back if possible, in those kind of environments. If we can cover the kind of the front, that's great too, and the side, that's even better. So building on that kind of refuge feeling. And the last part is comfort. Like we said, the kind of critical pairing of activity and seating and table to kind of match to make sure we're kind of optimizing that environment for somebody. So those three elements. I do want to end on aesthetics. Like I said earlier, we were going to talk a little bit about aesthetics. And the reason why I end on this is those first three are kind of real critical. Like they're literally real critical building blocks. But as you build something, you need glue to pull it all together. And so aesthetics is that glue that kind of binds these things together. Because at the end of the day, we are aesthetically driven creatures. We are drawn to things, whether they're man-made beauty, natural beauty. We're drawn to certain objects and environments. And they come in many different shapes and sizes. There's not one thing that, we all universally find beautiful. You're going to get different opinions. But there are certain, we can't deny kind of like our aesthetic driven selves. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind. So for example, like this is a space, and I'm sure in here we can find spaces that create refuge. We can have prospect, there's we can kind of separate the space out we need to, but it's not aesthetically not the greatest environment. The lighting is it's all right. The way things are set up with the books, like there's a lot of papers around, it's just not super engaging. Same space, getting people kind of nice, cozy lounge, maybe longer term area by the windows, redoing the bookshelves to let like more light come through, adjusting the light, really kind of stepping that aesthetic level. I use this as an example, and obviously it's extreme, but these are like graduate study rooms. I mean, it's like, I get there was probably a pragmatic reason, like, hey, we got to kind of create like little offices cost effectively, so it's like sitting in a cage. You got a lot of light here, I guess, but you walk down this super dark hallway to get to your cage, not the most engaging space. Compared to this, like, look at this environment. I got these nice big wingback chairs. I got the blinders on my side here, fireplace, some more biofuel elements. You got fire, you got stone, some like kind of earthy materials in there, wood, warmth of the wood, much more engaging environment. Kind of, and again, looking at another two environments together. You've got individuals kind of thrown in the study carriage. You got the group, people out in the open. Same kind of seating, requirements here, but individuals are kind of sitting more in that kind of command central type feel. Nobody looks straight across at each other. Got, the blinders on here. they're trying to do their best to try to kind of build some implied refuge if possible. The group seating, here, giving them kind of the privacy, that, groups need from time to time. So, like we said, we talked about these elements, and aesthetics is that kind of glue that binds it all together. And I give this example usually at the end here. Like, I have a background in aviation, and when we learn this in physics class and learn this in your aerodynamics classes, how the airplane wing flies, it's Bernoulli, high low pressure generates lift. I think a lot of people know that and remember that from physics class. But what they don't talk about when you first kind of learn that principle is that there also needs to be air molecules in the air, and that actually accounts for Bernoulli's effect accounts for about 90% of the reason why the airplane wing flies. But if you don't have enough air molecules in the air, that last 10%, it won't work. So while I don't like to have things completely driven by aesthetics, I think that starts to erode some of these other core principles of that speak to our human behavior. But you need that aesthetic element to kind of complete that engagement. So I thank everybody for their time today. I really appreciate the opportunity. And then, if people have questions, we can take them now. You can always feel free to email me at the email address below, jsagati@agati.com.
Thank you, Joe. Well, people have time to put questions in the chat box. My question is, have you worked with, or is it in planning in the future, or to take this technology or this information that you're gaining and put it into airplane seats, or basically the comfort on airlines?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? It came through a little scrambled on my end.
I'm sorry. With the technology that you're learning here, is any of this information being given to the airlines for more comfort on like long flights or any of that?
Oh, yeah, actually, that is an interesting question. No, not necessarily. I think so. When we're doing airports, we're mostly focused kind of in the terminal spaces. I think what's happened is like I said before, I'm discussing these things in a bit of a vacuum. And so it's the real challenging part is when you're trying to really pull it into the real world. And then especially airline and aviation market is probably the most difficult because there are a lot of rules and regulations you have to follow. So, I had an interesting conversation with a planner, and his job was to, kind of figure out the seat count that you had to have in a hold room. And a lot of that was driven, I think, by the airline, maybe some by the FAA or whatever. And him and I talking about it, and he completely agrees that he knows you put 200 seats in there, not 200 people are going to sit, but you're kind of held to this requirement. So to me, that it's a really, really interesting opportunity. We know we can't move this parameter of we have to have 90% of whatever the largest airplane is going to fly into this gate. This is for the seat requirement. So we know we have to have it. So yeah, are there more interesting, innovative ways that if this is the requirement there, are there ways we can work around that? It's an interesting puzzle. I'm not saying we haven't tried to chip away at it, try to figure it out. There's something in there. But how it translates into the airplane, no, I have not. That's, again, a whole nother level of kind of constraints that you have to deal with the airline.
Okay. Well, we do have a very interesting question. And the question is, does color matter when you're looking at all of this information?
So does color matter as you're looking at all this information? Is the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. I think color plays a big role, and I think it plays a role especially into that aesthetic. I cannot speak to saying certain colors, elicit certain kind of feelings, but I would say more so depending on what the environment is, whether it's color, whether it's kind of visual aesthetics, that can play into it. So, for example, people are really gravitate towards the round pod. Creates that kind of warm hug. I would argue, though, that if you were to have a very kind of traditional environment, that dropping this kind of very contemporary looking element in there would be distracting, even though we know people love it. So I think that's where it creates a space of you should maybe have a square one, because that kind of fits with that aesthetics more. I think people recognize kind of like odd juxtapositions and maybe have a hard time kind of verbalizing that, but then it creates disengagement in there. I think color can kind of play into that. So, I mean, I've seen things work where it was Florida Gulf Coast. They have, and it kind of makes sense in Florida. It's these really beautiful, vibrant kind of like colors. They had a lot of lounge chairs, seating, single, double pods, banquettes, kind of throughout the space. But like very engaging for that environment. I think if you were to try to drop that into like the kind of, kind of more dense Northeast kind of aesthetic, I think it'd be very, very disruptive depending on how it was done. So yeah, I think not so much from like a specific color eliciting something, but more about what works with the environment. And then especially it goes into like over a long period of time. Like I try to avoid fast fashion, fast trends, especially when it comes around to aesthetics, because they're very cyclical. There are things that definitely fit into the more timeless vein. And I think architects and interior designers, good ones have a really good pulse on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, it looks like that was our question for today, but I'm sure people will be reaching out to you as they have more specific questions or have time to think about or talk about what you've given us today. So, Joe, thank you so much for this presentation. And as always, to our attendees, thank you for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedule. So until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and be kind to one another. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.